New York Fashion Week, 1 week out of the year when thousands of people flock to New York City to discover and praise the new fashion that will influence the next year and probably even longer than that. Clothing is something that connects people, regardless of their race, gender, or ethnicity. Few people have wondered why their clothing looks the way that it does. Today I plan to inform you on how major events throughout history have influenced fashion from the 1940s to the early 2000s. The first event that I want to talk about is World War II and its impact on clothing of the time. I then will talk about the social changes in the 60s and 70s and how that impacted their clothing. And then I'll talk about the digital revolution and the effects that had on the clothing of the 90s. The first event that I will talk about is World War II. That started in 1939 and ended in 1945. This caused women to join the labor force and work in factories. This meant that their clothing was no longer suitable for their working environment. So women started to wear shirts and pants. The Fashion History Timeline website, last updated August 2018, states that because of our fabric shortages, clothes had to become more minimalist. World War II also changed the attitudes and the image of the ideal woman. Women were no longer seen as incapable of working and being strong. The shift in the perception of the woman helped society become more comfortable with the idea of women dressing more manly. In her 1984 book, Creating Rosie the Riveter, Class, Gender, and the Propaganda of World War II, Marianne Honey stated that the jobs that women had to do required masculine ability and attitudes. This is something that women had to adapt to. The second major point that changed fashion was the social changes of the 60s and the 70s. As the 60s came about, teens were more individualized and expressive. They adopted a more rebellious style, wearing shorter and more revealing clothing. The U.S. News website, last updated in March 2010, states that teens were more drawn to rebellion and to the defiance of the establishment into which they were raised. This was also a time when the women's movement was also gaining ground. In her 1963 book, The Feminist Mystique, Betty Freeman stated that aging is not lost youth, but a new stage of opportunity and strength. This highlights the changing image of the young, beautiful housewife for a more realistic version of a woman. By the end of this time period, women had gained a lot of freedom when it came to their clothing. The next shift that would come in the 90s would be much more focused on being influenced by new styles rather than trying to rebel against old ones. The last major event that I want to talk about is the digital revolution that happened in the 1990s that influenced the age of mixed styles. The advent of the World Wide Web made it possible for people to be influenced by styles from all around the world. People are no longer limited to taking influence from the people around them, but rather from a vast number of cultures. An article by author Victoria Ledzema, Globalization and Fashion, Too Fast, Too Furious, published October 25th, 2017. For the L'Oreal Undergraduate Journal of the Arts, explained that the internet and globalization gave rise to a new type of fashion, fast fashion, where clothes could be produced really fast and cheap. This allowed for much more variation in style. Another thing that the internet did for fashion was cause fashion trend changes to speed up. Now with information being given to us much quicker, people's desire for new and changing looks has only increased. In an interview on July 21st, 2011, with the Dolce & Gabbana creators, they explained that they had to shift their entire company in order to keep up with this new way of presenting fashion. Understanding how World War II, the social shifts of the 60s and 70s, and the digital revolution of the 90s can give you a new perspective on how it is that your clothes look the way that they do. It is important to recognize the underlying causes that have motivated the cultural and clothing changes, and to understand that this did not just happen randomly. Now, anytime you hear about a big fashion event like New York Fashion Week, you can have a better appreciation for how it is that we got to this point in our fashion history.